My name is Callista Eugene, and I was 17 years old the night my parents pulled me out of high school to be my sister's free nanny. My father delivered the verdict right over the Tuesday night pot roast. He slid my advanced psychology textbook away from my plate, looked me dead in the eye, and told me my older sister had a real future in the corporate world, while I did not. I did not scream or throw my plate. I packed my textbooks into an empty diaper box that night and said nothing. I spent the next 9 years raising her 3 kids while my family treated me like invisible domestic labor. They thought they had buried me in that suburban living room. They did not know I was turning their neglect into a data set and that living room into a laboratory. Years later, when the phone finally rang, it was not a local temp agency. It was the dean of the most prestigious Ivy League university in Pennsylvania, offering me a buyout that would turn my family's arrogance into a permanent public humiliation. Welcome back to Morning Revenge, the channel where invisible daughters finally hand their families the bill. How old were you when you realized your family only loved what they could extract from you? Drop your age in the comments below and make sure you subscribe. To understand how a family casually erases a daughter, you have to see the dining room where it happened. In our pocket of Pennsylvania, academic potential meant nothing unless it carried a 6-figure starting salary and a business card. My father, Richard, wore branded golf polos and believed middle management was the height of human achievement. My mother, Helen, ran the neighborhood association like a military operation. That Tuesday, the air in our dining room felt tight. The clink of silverware against porcelain sounded too sharp. My older sister, Sarah, sat across from me, scrolling through her phone. Beside her was Greg, her husband, studying his cuticles. Greg's third independent sales venture had folded that very morning. The mortgage on their sprawling colonial house was due, and Sarah had just been handed a regional director title at a logistics firm. They had 3 children under the age of 8 and 0 liquid capital to pay for daycare. The family required a bailout, and my father had already done the math. "We are making a structural pivot," Richard announced. He folded his hands over his placemat. "Sarah's promotion requires her focus. Greg needs time to network. Childcare is an expense they cannot carry." My throat went dry. The iced tea in my glass suddenly looked very far away. I told him I could pick the kids up after my afternoon lab period. "No," my father said. His voice was flat, carrying the weight of a judge handing down a sentence. "You are withdrawing from the magnet program tomorrow. You will move into the spare room at Sarah's house and watch the children full-time." I stared at him. The state science fair was 6 weeks away. I had early admissions testing for a neurobehavioral track next month. I tried to say the words to explain the track, the college credits I had already earned. "A piece of paper," he interrupted, waving his hand as if brushing away a gnat. "Theoretical nonsense. Sarah has a tangible career. Do your part." My mother reached across the table and patted my wrist. Her skin felt like ice. "It is just the pragmatic choice, Callie. You can get a GED online later. We all have to sacrifice." I looked at Sarah. She never even glanced up from her screen. My entire future was bleeding out onto the oak table, and she was answering an email. In our family, roles were assigned by perceived utility. My utility was reduced to keeping toddlers quiet so the adults could perform success for the neighbors. 2 hours later, the house was dark. I sat on the carpet of my bedroom, tracing the glossy cover of my psychology textbook. Beside me was an empty Pampers box Greg had dropped off earlier that week. The cardboard smelled like warehouse dust. I placed the psychology book inside. My biology notes went next, followed by the statistics binders. I taped the box shut, running my thumb over the sharp plastic edge of the tape. Tomorrow, I would trade a laboratory for a chaotic living room. But sitting in the dark, my hands stopped trembling. They could take away my classroom. They had no idea I was about to build my own. The transition from straight-A student to full-time domestic servant did not happen with the dramatic slam of a door. It happened in a slow, suffocating blur of unwashed laundry, spilled juice, and the relentless ticking of the kitchen clock. By the time I turned 19, my world had shrunk to the property lines of my sister's suburban Pennsylvania lot. I was legally an adult, yet I slept in a 10 by 10 spare room that smelled permanently of diaper rash cream and stale graham crackers. Sarah and Greg treated their home like a hotel lobby, a place to simply pass through between their actual priorities. Greg spent his days on the golf course, claiming he was networking for his next big venture, though his golf bag was the only thing holding his fragile ego together. Sarah treated her regional director title like a royal decree. She left the house at 7 in the morning in sharp, tailored suits, returning 12 hours later, expecting a spotless kitchen, 3 bathed children, and dinner warming in the oven. To the wealthy neighbors down the street, they were the picture of modern American ambition. To me, they were ghosts who left their mess behind. The real weight of my new life did not come from the endless piles of dishes or the laundry. It came from Jack. When I first unpacked my bags in that spare room, Jack was just a toddler. By the time he turned 3, the shadows over his development were impossible to ignore. It started with the silence. While his older siblings, Lily and Mason, chattered relentlessly, Jack's vocabulary simply vanished. He retreated into a quiet, rigid world where the slightest deviation from his routine caused the ground to crack beneath him. His sensory overloads were terrifying to watch. The sudden hum of the refrigerator compressor kicking on would send him diving under the dining table, his small hands clamped over his ears, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The tag on a cotton shirt felt like sandpaper to his skin, triggering meltdowns that lasted for an hour. I tried to bring it up to Sarah one afternoon while she was reapplying her lipstick in the hallway mirror. We were due at a neighborhood barbecue in 20 minutes, and Jack was currently curled in a tight ball on the living room rug, sobbing because the sunlight hitting the carpet created a harsh geometric shadow he could not process. I stood in the doorway holding his shoes. I suggested keeping my voice low and steady, that we might need to schedule an evaluation. I mentioned the term sensory processing. I mentioned regression. Sarah snapped the cap back onto her lipstick with a sharp click. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. She did not look at her son writhing on the rug. She looked at my wrinkled t-shirt. "He is just difficult Callie," she snapped, checking her teeth in the mirror. "He knows how to push buttons. If you were actually strict with him, instead of coddling every little tantrum, we would not have this problem. I am not having those gossipy women at the club whispering that my child is defective." "Put his shoes on. We are leaving in 5 minutes." She grabbed her designer purse and walked out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind her. The vibration of the slammed door sent Jack into a secondary panic. He screamed a raw, jagged sound that scraped the paint off the walls. I did not force his shoes on. I dropped them, walked over, and sat on the floor beside him. I did not touch him, knowing physical contact would only worsen the overload. I just sat in his line of sight and breathed slowly, exaggerating the rise and fall of my chest until his frantic breathing began to mirror mine. That afternoon, staring at the dust motes dancing in the terrifying slice of sunlight on the rug, my suppressed anger hardened into a cold, clinical focus. Sarah and Greg were never going to help him. Their social standing was far more valuable to them than their son's neurological reality. If Jack was going to survive this house, I had to stop acting like a babysitter and start acting like the scientist my father told me I would never be. That night, after the children were finally asleep, I pulled the old Pampers box out from under my bed. I broke the packing tape. I pulled out my advanced psychology and neurobiology textbooks, dusting off the covers. The suburban colonial transformed into my private laboratory. I began tracking Jack's behavior with rigorous precision. I carried a small notepad in my pocket, logging every trigger, every environmental shift, every antecedent to his meltdowns. I mapped his nervous system on paper, identifying the specific frequencies of sound and the exact transitions in his routine that caused him pain. But paper was static. Jack's mind moved too fast for handwritten logs. He needed real-time feedback, a system that could intervene before his anxieties spiked into a full sensory crash. The solution arrived a month later when Greg threw a second-hand tablet into the kitchen trash can. He had dropped it on the driveway, shattering the glass in a spiderweb pattern across the screen. He cursed it, bought a brand new one the next morning, and left the broken device buried under coffee grounds and eggshells. I dug it out, cleaned it with rubbing alcohol, and plugged it into my wall. The battery held a charge. Half the screen was unresponsive to touch, but the processor still worked. During the 2 hours each afternoon when Jack slept, I sat on the floor of my bedroom with that cracked device. I could not afford courses, so I scoured free open-source forums teaching myself the brutal, unforgiving syntax of basic coding. My workspace was a testament to the life my parents forced upon me. At 2 a.m, the only illumination in my room came from a plastic Paw Patrol nightlight plugged into the wall. It cast a dim blue glow over my exhausted face. My fingers traced the jagged cracks on the screen as I typed out strings of logic. If this input, then this output. I was not just writing code. I was translating human psychology into an algorithmic loop. I designed a digital interface specifically tailored to Jack's visual processing needs. No harsh colors, no sharp angles, just soft, expanding and contracting shapes that mimicked deep breathing paired with predictable low-frequency tones. I gamified his emotional regulation, creating a digital safe room he could hold in his hands. The first field test happened on a Tuesday. The landscaping crew arrived next door, firing up a leaf blower. The sudden, high-pitched mechanical roar pierced the living room walls. I saw Jack freeze. His eyes widened, his shoulders creeping up toward his ears. The precursor to the scream. Before the panic could take hold, I slid the cracked tablet onto the floor in front of him. The screen glowed soft green. A simple circle pulsed in the center, expanding slowly, then contracting. A gentle rhythmic chime sounded from the speaker, cutting through the chaotic noise of the leaf blower outside. Jack stared at it. His hands hovering near his ears, slowly lowered. He reached out with one tiny finger and touched the pulsing green circle. The screen shifted to a calming blue, rewarding his touch with a soft, ascending note. I watched his chest. The shallow, frantic breath smoothed out, matching the visual rhythm of the shape on the screen. He did not scream. He sat cross-legged, anchored by the digital loop I had built in the dark. The science worked. The system was flawless. Over the next 6 months, the change in Jack was undeniable. His meltdowns decreased by 80%. He started using small words again to request the tablet when he felt overwhelmed. He was finding his way back to the surface. Sarah noticed the quiet, of course. She stood in the kitchen one evening pouring a glass of expensive wine, watching Jack calmly stack blocks while the television blared in the background. She smiled, a smug, self-satisfied expression spreading across her face. "My strict scheduling is finally paying off," she told Helen over the phone later that night, her voice dripping with unearned pride. "I told you he just needed discipline. Callie means well, but she is far too soft. It takes a real mother to set boundaries." I stood in the hallway, gripping the laundry basket, listening to her rewrite reality to flatter her own ego. She had no idea the boundaries keeping her son tethered to the earth were written in Python, housed on a cracked device hidden under my mattress. I knew then that my app, which I secretly named Mind Steps, was powerful. It was a lifeline. But the more complex the code became, the more data I needed to store. The tablet was running out of memory. I needed to host the architecture on a cloud server, and servers required monthly subscriptions. I was 19 years old. I worked 80 hours a week. I had $0 to my name. If I was going to save my nephew and ultimately save myself, I had to find a way to generate income from inside a house that viewed me as nothing more than unpaid property. 4 years dissolved into a relentless sequence of packed lunches, folded laundry, and illuminated screens. I turned 21 alone in my sister's kitchen, blowing out a single candle stuck into a leftover blueberry muffin. To the outside world, I was a high school dropout, permanently tethered to my niece and nephews. In reality, I had quietly earned my general equivalency diploma online, studying during the brief windows when the children watched cartoons. My real education, however, lived inside the expanding architecture of Mind Steps. The behavioral tracking loop I built for Jack had evolved. I moved past basic visual stimuli and programmed a sophisticated predictive algorithm. The software could now analyze his sleep patterns, dietary inputs, and daily routine disruptions to forecast a sensory overload hours before it materialized. Jack was thriving, his vocabulary returning in full sentences, his meltdowns reduced to rare, manageable moments. But sophisticated algorithms required profound processing power. The cracked tablet could no longer house the data sets. I needed to migrate MindSteps to a secure cloud server, and cloud hosting required monthly capital. I had no bank account and no resume. So I became a digital ghost. From midnight until 3 in the morning, while my sister and her husband slept, I logged on to anonymous freelance platforms. I operated under a pseudonym, tutoring wealthy high school students across different time zones in advanced calculus and cognitive science. The glow of my laptop screen was my only companion. Exhaustion settled deep into my bones, a permanent ache behind my eyes. But every $50 deposit was a brick in the foundation of my escape. The fragile ecosystem held together until early November, when my mother decided to conduct one of her unannounced inspections. Helen possessed the boundary recognition of a wrecking ball. She let herself in through the front door one Tuesday morning while I was in the backyard pushing the youngest child on the swing. I had left my laptop open on the kitchen counter, the screen displaying a fresh deposit notification from my freelance dashboard. When I walked inside, the temperature in the room had plummeted. My mother stood perfectly still over the island, her manicured finger hovering above the trackpad. She did not ask me about the code running in the background. She did not ask why a supposed dropout was earning $50 an hour teaching calculus. Her gaze was locked entirely on the available balance in the top right corner. $640. She turned her head, her expression hardening into a mask of calculated disappointment. "You have been holding out on your sister," she said, her voice a hushed, dangerous whisper. I froze, the diaper bag sliding off my shoulder. I explained the money was for a software project, a tool I built to help Jack. Helen waved her hand, dismissing the survival of her own grandson as a trivial excuse. "Sarah works herself to the bone to keep a roof over your head, Callie. Greg is under immense pressure, and you are hoarding secret cash while eating their food. It is selfish." She did not wait for a response. She simply picked up her designer purse and walked out carrying my secret straight to my father. The hammer fell 2 weeks later during Thanksgiving dinner. The holiday was another orchestrated performance. Sarah had purchased expensive catering and plated it on her good china to simulate domestic perfection. Greg sat at the end of the table, swirling a glass of bourbon, loudly complaining about the unfair market conditions that had derailed his luxury vehicle brokerage venture. His failures were always framed as external tragedies, never personal incompetence. Richard, my father, sat at the head of the table, carving the turkey with precise, clinical cuts. He waited until the plates were full to initiate the ambush. "Your mother informed me about your little online hobby," Richard stated, not looking up from the meat. The clatter of silverware stopped. Sarah paused her fork, hovering near her mouth. Greg looked up from his bourbon. "We have indulged this free ride long enough," Richard continued, pointing the carving knife toward me. "Greg is navigating a complex career transition. Sarah carries the mortgage. You occupy a bedroom, consume electricity, and eat their groceries. Effective immediately, you will surrender your tutoring earnings to Greg at the end of each month. Consider it retroactive rent." The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of the demand knocked the breath out of my lungs. I worked 80 hours a week, raising 3 children they routinely ignored. A professional behavioral nanny in our zip code commanded 6 figures. I received 0 compensation, 0 health insurance, and 0 days off. Now they intended to strip away the meager scraps I earned while sacrificing my own sleep. They framed it as familial duty. Helen chimed in, her tone dripping with toxic sweetness, saying families must support each other during lean times, conveniently ignoring that I was the only one permanently starving. I looked at Sarah, hoping for a fraction of sisterly defense. She merely shrugged, taking a sip of her wine. "Greg needs the seed money," she said smoothly. It is the least you can do, Callie. I realized in that exact moment that to my blood relatives, I was not a daughter. I was not a sister. I was an unlimited resource, a well they intended to pump until it ran dry. Arguing would only result in my eviction, and an eviction meant leaving Jack unprotected. I reached into the pocket of my jeans. I had anticipated a confrontation and prepared an offering to buy my peace. I pulled out a personal check written from the basic checking account I had opened a month prior. It was for $400, representing nearly 3 weeks of sleepless nights and grinding labor. The paper was slightly crumpled. I smoothed it out and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward my brother-in-law. Greg reached out and took it. He did not say thank you. He did not even look me in the eye. He simply folded the check in half, shoved it into the pocket of his slacks, and returned to scrolling on his smartphone, his face illuminated by the glow of a sports betting application. The profound humiliation of that single gesture burned away the last lingering thread of loyalty I held for my family. The heat of my anger condensed into a sharp, crystalline clarity. I would play their game, but I would rewrite the rules in a language they could not read. I nodded submissively, keeping my gaze lowered to my plate, performing the role of the defeated servant. "Yes, Dad," I murmured. "I understand." I complied outwardly, but my obedience was a hollow shell. That very night, sitting in the blue glow of the Paw Patrol nightlight, I executed a silent financial pivot. I kept the local checking account active, funneling just enough tutoring income into it to generate a modest monthly tribute for Greg, keeping their greed satisfied and their suspicions dormant. The rest of my earnings, the bulk of my sleepless labor, required a ghost infrastructure. I spent 4 hours navigating decentralized financial networks, utilizing my coding proficiency to build a digital fortress. I opened an encrypted offshore-style account that required dual-factor biometric authentication to access. There were no paper statements, no local branch records, and no physical debit cards for my mother to discover on the kitchen counter. Every dollar over their required tribute was routed directly into the encrypted ledger. It was a slow, agonizing process, accumulating wealth $50 at a time. But the server fees for MindSteps were finally covered. The algorithm breathed expanded and began processing Jack's data with unprecedented speed. My survival now hinged on absolute financial secrecy. I was funding a digital empire from a child's bedroom, preparing the technology for a world far beyond the Pennsylvania suburbs. The architecture of my software was flawless, but I knew data models in a vacuum meant nothing. For MindSteps to truly matter, for my ticket out of this house to be validated, the software needed to withstand the scrutiny of professional medical authority. I just needed the right pair of eyes to look at the screen. The grueling rhythm of domestic isolation continued to dictate my waking hours, but the ecosystem inside the walls of that suburban Pennsylvania home was shifting. Jack had reached his 6th birthday, crossing the threshold into 1st grade. To my sister and brother-in-law, the passage of time meant nothing more than buying larger clothes and complaining about the cost of school supplies. To me, it represented 3 years of unbroken, rigorous data collection. The encrypted servers I funded through Midnight Tutoring had allowed MindSteps to evolve from a simple visual pacifier into a comprehensive neurological predictive engine. The profound results of that engine were impossible to conceal, leading directly to the next inevitable collision between my hidden reality and their curated fiction. The catalyst was a mandatory pediatric evaluation required by Jack's elementary school. Sarah usually delegated all medical appointments to me, treating her son's health logistics with the same disdain she reserved for taking out the trash. However, the school district required a legal guardian present for this specific baseline assessment. Sarah was forced to take a rare morning away from her regional director desk. She treated the upscale mainline pediatric clinic like a corporate networking event. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her heels clicking sharply against the polished linoleum floors. In the waiting room, she ignored Jack entirely, choosing instead to flip through a glossy architectural magazine while tapping her foot with impatient rhythm. Jack sat beside me, his small legs dangling over the edge of the vinyl chair. The clinic was a sensory minefield. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a high-frequency buzz. The scent of sterile alcohol wipes and synthetic air freshener permeated the enclosed space. 3 years ago, this environment would have triggered an immediate, paralyzing meltdown. Today, Jack simply closed his eyes, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, self-soothing sequence against his denim jeans, a physical anchor he learned directly from the MindSteps interface. He was regulating his own nervous system in real time. A nurse called his name. We filed into examination room 4. Dr. Adler entered a few moments later. He was a seasoned diagnostician, a man whose private practice catered to the wealthiest, most demanding families in the state. He carried a silver tablet, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through Jack's historical medical file. The last entry in this chart is from when Jack was 36 months old, Dr. Adler murmured, leaning against the counter. The notes indicate profound language deficits, severe atypical sensory processing, and chronic dysregulation. We recommended early intervention therapies. We did not need them, Sarah stated smoothly, crossing her arms. She offered a practiced, patronizing smile. Therapy is a crutch for parents who refuse to establish authority in their own households. Dr. Adler did not argue. He simply turned his attention to Jack. He initiated a series of cognitive and reflex tests, checking fine motor skills, spatial reasoning, and conversational pacing. He dropped a metal reflex hammer onto a stainless steel tray, creating a sharp, sudden clatter designed to test startle responses. Jack flinched, but he did not scream. He took a deep, deliberate breath, expanding his diaphragm precisely the way the green digital circle on my app had taught him, and returned his focus to the doctor. A sharp inhale broke Dr. Adler's clinical composure. He lowered his diagnostic light, staring at the 6-year-old boy sitting calmly on the crinkling paper of the exam table. The neurological progression here defies standard clinical timelines, he said, his voice laced with genuine astonishment. The structural adaptation in his emotional regulation is staggering. Children with his initial markers do not organically develop these coping mechanisms without highly specialized, intensive clinical intervention. Sarah basked in the medical praise as if she had personally rewired her son's prefrontal cortex. "It just takes a firm hand, doctor," she replied, her tone oozing unearned pride. "Strict schedules, early bedtimes. I simply do not tolerate tantrums." And Jack learned to adapt. It is traditional parenting. Dr. Adler offered a tight, polite nod, though his eyes reflected deep skepticism. Traditional parenting did not teach a neurologically atypical child to consciously manipulate their own vagus nerve. Before Sarah could elaborate on her fictional Mother of the Year narrative, her smartphone vibrated loudly in her blazer pocket. A logistics crisis at her firm. She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes to signal how indispensable she was to the corporate world. "I need to take this," she announced, already turning toward the door. "Callie, make sure he gets his vaccination paperwork." The heavy door clicked shut, leaving a sudden, dense silence in the examination room. Dr. Adler turned away from the door and looked directly at me. I had retreated to the corner of the room holding Jack's winter coat, blending into the background as I had been trained to do. The pediatrician did not see a teenage dropout. He saw the only other adult in the room, observing Jack with a quiet, analytical vigilance. "It is not discipline, is it?" Dr. Adler asked softly. I hesitated. The survival of my digital empire relied on absolute secrecy. But the isolation was a heavy stone I had carried alone for years. I needed an objective professional to tell me if my code was truly as revolutionary as I believed. "It is predictive algorithmic mitigation," I replied, keeping my voice low. We mapped his environmental antecedents. By charting his sensory threshold degradation over a rolling 24-hour period, we can introduce gamified emotional regulation loops before the neurological crash occurs. Dr. Adler froze. The silver tablet in his hand dipped slightly. "That is graduate-level diagnostic phrasing," he said, stepping closer. "Who designed that protocol?" I reached into my canvas tote bag. I bypassed the diapers and the juice boxes, pulling out my upgraded, dedicated coding tablet. I unlocked the screen and launched the developer dashboard of MindSteps. I handed the device to the physician. Dr. Adler looked at the illuminated interface. He swiped through the back-end data architecture, his eyes widening as he registered the biometric syncing, the pattern recognition formulas, and the flawless, clean user interface designed for a child's visual processing needs. The clinic was perfectly quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights, as a seasoned medical professional realized he was holding a technological marvel inside a routine checkup room. "This software does not exist on the commercial market," he whispered, tracing a line graph detailing Jack's cortisol reduction over a 6-month span. "I have affluent clients spending thousands of dollars a month on cognitive behavioral therapy, attempting to achieve a fraction of this efficacy." "You built this?" "Yes," I said. "Are you affiliated with a university research hospital?" "I am. My sister's nanny," I replied, the bitter truth tasting like ash. Dr. Adler looked from the tablet to Jack and then back to me. He recognized the profound disparity between my intellect and my station. He did not ask questions about my family dynamic. He simply saw a monumental professional opportunity. "I want to deploy this," he stated, his tone shifting from medical inquiry to rigorous business negotiation. "I have a roster of 12 neurodivergent patients in my private practice who are failing standard therapeutic models. I want to license a beta version of this application for their immediate use. Name your licensing fee." The ground beneath my feet shifted. I was no longer a domestic servant begging for scraps at the Thanksgiving table. I was a software vendor fielding my first business-to-business contract from a high-net-worth medical practice. I calculated my encrypted server costs, added a premium for ongoing technical support, and quoted a figure that would have made my father choke on his golf polo. Dr. Adler did not blink. He pulled a pristine white business card from his breast pocket and handed it to me. "Have your legal entity send the beta agreements to this email by Friday," he instructed. The heavy door swung open. Sarah stepped back into the room, shoving her phone into her pocket, radiating corporate irritation. "Crisis averted," she sighed. "Are we finished here? I have a regional conference call in 20 minutes. "We are finished," Dr. Adler said, handing Jack his vaccination paperwork. He walked us to the door. He offered a polite, generic farewell to my sister. Then he turned to me, his expression carrying a quiet, unmistakable weight. "I look forward to reviewing those files, colleague," he said. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her brow furrowed into a deep, confused frown. She looked at the doctor, then turned her gaze toward me, scanning my faded jeans and plain sweater as if trying to decipher a foreign language. "Colleague." The word hung in the air between us, a tiny, sharp crack in the glass of her curated reality. She dismissed it a second later with a shake of her head, assuming the doctor had simply misspoken. We walked out into the crisp Pennsylvania morning. The contrast was stark. Inside that clinic, my genius had finally been recognized by the medical establishment. Outside, I was expected to strap my nephew into a car seat and return to a life of silent servitude. The licensing revenue from Dr. Adler's practice was about to flood my encrypted accounts, transforming my small survival fund into significant, undeniable wealth. But wealth generates a digital footprint, and success demands infrastructure. My offshore shell account was not designed to handle formal medical licensing contracts. The stakes were elevating rapidly. I had to build a legitimate corporate shield before the money grew too large to hide a task made exponentially more dangerous by the lavish, performative social event my mother was actively planning for the upcoming weekend. The fragile boundaries of my secret life were preparing to collide violently with my family's obsession with public status. The licensing contracts with Dr. Adler necessitated a formal corporate shield. I spent 48 hours weaving a legal labyrinth, registering an anonymous corporate entity in Delaware, using my encrypted funds to pay the proxy agent. My digital anonymity was secured just as my family demanded a very public, tangible performance of their own success. Sarah had successfully lobbied her upper management, securing a vice president title at her logistics firm. For my parents, a corporate promotion without an audience was a wasted opportunity. They rented the grand ballroom at the regional country club. The venue smelled of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the heavy perfume of Pennsylvania old money. The guest list was meticulously curated by Helen, populated with Ivy League-educated neighbors, local politicians, and country club board members. This event was a physical manifestation of my parents' worldview. Success was a title you could print on thick cardstock, and a salary you could whisper about over champagne. I was technically required to attend, but I was not a guest. Helen assigned me the role of unpaid domestic staff. I spent the first hour stationed by the mahogany entrance doors taking heavy wool coats and damp cashmere scarves from arriving attendees. Once the coat check duties slowed, my role shifted to child management. I hovered along the velvet wallpapered perimeter of the ballroom, ensuring Jack, Lily, and Mason did not disrupt the caterers or ruin their formal attire. The contrast was stark. I wore a plain dark dress bought off a discount rack years ago, fading into the shadows of the opulent room. Sarah held court near the center ice sculpture, draped in emerald silk, laughing loudly at jokes made by senior partners. Greg stood nearby, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, nodding along as if he had personally orchestrated his wife's ascent, rather than surviving entirely on her paycheck and my stolen tutoring wages. The first sharp sting of the evening occurred when the hired photographer corralled the family near the grand marble fireplace for an official portrait. The photographer, a young woman with a heavy digital camera, directed the grouping. Richard and Helen stood in the center, flanked by Sarah and Greg. The grandchildren were arranged in the front. I stepped toward the edge of the frame, assuming I would stand behind Lily. Before I could plant my feet, I felt a cold, firm pressure on my right shoulder. Helen smiled brightly for the camera, her teeth gleaming, but her hand gripped my shoulder with an iron tension. She did not look at me. She simply applied a sustained push, stepping sideways to close the gap where I had tried to stand. The physical rejection was swift and undeniable. Just the core unit, Callie Helen, murmured through her fixed smile, her voice too low for the photographer to hear. You understand. The framing is too wide. Why do not you go check on the dessert catering? I stumbled back half a step, the fabric of my cheap dress slipping out from under her manicured fingers. The flash of the camera fired, capturing the perfect, symmetrical illusion of their success. I was standing 3 feet away, trapped in the cold shadow of the fireplace, permanently erased from their documented history. I did not cry. I smoothed the front of my dress, turned on my heel, and walked toward the catering doors. I understood the framing perfectly. A dropout nanny did not fit the aesthetic of a vice president's ascension. An hour later, the true purpose of the evening commenced. The string quartet stopped playing. Richard tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute, drawing the attention of the 80 guests. The room quieted. Helen took the floor, holding a microphone. She delivered a sweeping theatrical speech praising Sarah's relentless ambition. She spoke of traditional values, hard work, and the prestige of climbing the corporate ladder. The audience, composed of wealthy traditionalists who valued predictable, structured achievements, nodded in unison. Then Helen's gaze swept across the room and locked onto me, standing near the kitchen swing doors, holding Jack's discarded suit jacket. And of course, we must acknowledge the unseen sacrifices that make Sarah's demanding career possible. Helen announced, her voice echoing through the ballroom speakers. She gestured toward me, ensuring every head in the room turned to follow her hand. We are so grateful to have Sarah's little helper under our roof. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Helen adopted a tone of toxic charity, the kind of voice one uses to describe a rescued stray dog. When Callista struggled with the rigors of high school and decided to drop out, we knew we had to provide a safety net. Helen continued spinning a masterful lie that inverted my forced servitude into a tale of her own benevolence. She may not have the capacity for higher education or the corporate drive of her sister, but she found a simple, quiet purpose, helping with the children. We believe every member of a family can contribute, regardless of their limitations. The condescension hit me like a physical wave. I stood under the gaze of 80 Ivy League-educated professionals, corporate lawyers, and legacy wealth inheritors. Their expressions morphed into a collective pitying grimace. To them, I was a tragic figure, a slow, uneducated dependent existing entirely on the goodwill of my brilliant sister. Sarah raised her glass toward me, accepting the applause of the room as if she were a saint for allowing me to wash her dishes. Greg smirked into his scotch. My father nodded, deeply satisfied with the narrative. They had weaponized my subjugation, using my supposed failure as a stepping stone to elevate Sarah even higher in the local social hierarchy. The toast concluded. The string quartet resumed a lively tempo. The guests returned to their conversations, having safely categorized me at the bottom of their social ecosystem. I retreated to a secluded alcove near the coat check, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. The sting of the public humiliation throbbed behind my temples, but I refused to let them see me break. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and withdrew my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and bypassed the dummy applications, opening my encrypted offshore dashboard. The beta licensing agreement with Dr. Adler had catalyzed a chain reaction within his high-net-worth medical network. Once his colleagues saw the staggering behavioral improvements in his neurodivergent patients, they demanded access to the MindSteps architecture. My anonymous Delaware corporation had been executing digital contracts all week. I stared at the glowing white numbers on the dark screen. Active paid users, 15,024. I tapped the financial ledger tab. The monthly recurring revenue figure populated the screen. I traced the commas with my thumb. The software I built on a cracked tablet in the blue glow of a nightlight was now generating more revenue in a single 30-day billing cycle than Sarah's new vice president's salary would pay her in an entire calendar year. I looked through the gap in the velvet curtain. I watched my mother schmoozing with a retired university dean. I watched my sister accepting congratulations from a local politician. They believed they owned the world. They believed they owned me. I smiled, the cold blue light of the screen illuminating my face in the dark alcove. They had just publicly declared me a simple-minded dropout. They had no idea they were drinking champagne funded by the credit limits of my sister's husband, while the true financial titan of the family was standing in the coat check corner. The satisfaction was profound, but the user count on my screen represented a new, terrifying reality. 15,000 active medical users generated an ocean of behavioral data. The algorithm was becoming too sophisticated, the outcomes too revolutionary to remain hidden in the shadows of private pediatric clinics. A data set this pure inevitably attracts apex predators. The quiet phase of my digital empire was ending. I was about to catch the attention of the one institution my family revered above all others, and the collision was going to shatter the walls of my suburban prison. The medical data generated by 15,000 neurodivergent users did not remain a localized secret. In the high-stakes realm of pediatric neurology, exceptional clinical outcomes travel with staggering speed. Dr. Adler and his affluent network began presenting their anonymized patient success charts at regional symposiums. They did not understand the underlying algorithmic architecture of my software, but they eagerly showcased the undeniable reduction in sensory meltdowns. Those pristine, sloping graphs caught the attention of the apex predator I had anticipated. Dr. Aris Thorne directed the most prestigious educational technology research division at the University of Pennsylvania. In our state, UPenn was the ultimate cathedral of intellect and legacy power, an institution my parents spoke of with hushed, sycophantic reverence. Dr. Thorne was a global authority on behavioral prediction models. When he attended a symposium in Boston and witnessed the MindSteps data presented by a suburban clinician, he did not just see improved patient outcomes. He saw a mathematical paradigm shift. He recognized a predictive loop so refined it rendered his own department's current million-dollar research obsolete. He bypassed the presenting doctors, utilizing university resources to trace my anonymous Delaware LLC back to its encrypted contact portal. The email arrived in my secure inbox on a rainy Thursday afternoon. It contained a UPenn domain address and a simple, direct request for a video conference. The subject line read, Urgent inquiry regarding MindStep's predictive architecture. I stared at the screen. My pulse beat a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. This was the precipice. Scheduling the call required intense logistical maneuvering. Sarah was at her logistics firm, and Greg was supposedly attending a real estate seminar, though his car remained parked in the driveway. The older children were at school. Jack was asleep in his room, anchored by the rhythmic hum of his customized digital interface. I needed an isolated, secure location within the house. I chose the laundry room. It was a narrow, windowless space situated at the end of the first-floor hallway. I locked the flimsy wooden door. The air inside felt thick, heavy, with the sharp synthetic scent of lavender fabric softener and the residual heat of the running dryer. I arranged a plastic laundry hamper upside down, transforming it into a makeshift desk. I placed my laptop on the ridged plastic surface. My backdrop was not a sleek corporate boardroom or a leather-bound library. It was a towering stack of freshly folded white bath towels, the undeniable physical proof of my indentured servitude. I smoothed my plain cotton shirt, took a deep breath, and initiated the secure video link. The screen divided. On the top half, Dr. Eris Thorne appeared. He sat behind a vast mahogany desk in an office lined with centuries-old academic volumes and framed patents. He wore a tailored tweed jacket, his silver hair neatly combed. He peered through his reading glasses, scanning his monitor, expecting a crowded conference room filled with seasoned software engineers and postdoctoral researchers. Instead, he saw a 25-year-old woman sitting in a humid utility closet. Dr. Thorne adjusted his glasses, a subtle frown creasing his forehead. "I am waiting for the MindStep's developmental team to join the bridge," he stated, his voice carrying the resonant, authoritative timbre of a lifelong academic. "Are you the administrative coordinator for the LLC?" "I am the lead developer," I replied, keeping my vocal tone even and devoid of hesitation. He paused. He leaned closer to his webcam. "And the rest of the engineering department?" "I am the engineering department," I said. "I wrote the foundational code, designed the user interface, and structured the predictive loops. The data sets you reviewed in Boston were generated by an algorithm I host on decentralized cloud servers." A heavy silence stretched across the digital connection. The rhythmic, muffled thud of the dryer spinning damp clothes behind me served as a surreal metronome. Dr. Thorne did not dismiss me. He did not mock my youth or my setting. He simply opened a file on his desktop and began the most rigorous intellectual interrogation of my life. He fired complex, high-level inquiries regarding neural network latency, biometric variable processing, and sensory threshold mapping. He tested the boundaries of my knowledge, searching for the true architect of the software. I met every question with clinical precision. I did not just recite theory. I explained the practical application of my code, detailing how I translated raw human panic into measurable, mitigatable data points. We spoke a shared, elevated language. For the first time in my existence, another human being engaged my intellect without a filter of utility, condescension, or disdain. I was not Sarah's little helper. I was not a dropout nanny. I was a peer. 2 hours vanished into the humid air of the laundry room. Dr. Thorne slowly took off his reading glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, slow breath. The skepticism had entirely evaporated from his features, replaced by a profound, almost reverent astonishment. "You built a self-correcting neurological tracking engine," he murmured, almost to himself. "You bypassed the entire established academic community. Where did you earn your doctorate?" I looked at the stack of folded towels. "I do not have a doctorate, Dr. Thorne. I withdrew from high school at 17. I am self-taught." The revelation landed like a physical blow. He stared at me through the lens, processing the monumental disparity between my lack of credentials and the genius of my creation. He did not care about the missing diploma. He cared about the undeniable reality of the math. "Callista," he said, using my name with a weight and respect my own father had never mustered. UPenn operates an elite educational technology incubator. It is traditionally reserved for tenured faculty and exceptional doctoral candidates. I am prepared to offer you an immediate, fully funded position as a director within this program. I will personally bypass the degree requirements. The university will provide the institutional infrastructure your software requires to scale globally. My breath caught in my throat. The offer was a direct key to the lock on my suburban cage. Furthermore, Dr. Thorne continued, his tone shifting into sharp, strategic negotiation. The University Research Hospital intends to acquire the exclusive clinical rights to the MindSteps architecture. Our initial valuation for the intellectual property, combined with your operational partnership, will be structured in the multi-million-dollar range. I will have our legal department draft the preliminary acquisition protocols today. I sat frozen on the cold linoleum floor of the laundry room. A multi-million-dollar acquisition from the most prestigious institution in Pennsylvania. Absolute, undeniable freedom was hovering on the screen in front of me, waiting for my confirmation. I accept the terms, Dr. Thorne. Please send the documents. The video call ended. The screen went dark, reflecting my own stunned expression. I closed the laptop. The dryer buzzed, a harsh, mechanical tone, signaling the end of its cycle. I had just secured an empire, but the transition from ghost developer to Ivy League director required a flawless, invisible exit. The wealth and the title were real, but they existed in a digital ether, highly vulnerable until the ink dried on the university contracts. I stood up, gathering my laptop. The preliminary agreements would be sent via email, requiring immediate review and digital signatures. The offshore encryption protected my banking, but standard legal correspondence required accessible channels. A digital trail was forming a bright, glowing path leading directly to a fortune. I unlocked the laundry room door and stepped into the hallway. The floorboards creaked above me. Heavy, unmistakable footsteps. Greg was not at a real estate seminar. He was upstairs pacing, desperate and chronically short on cash. The stakes had never been higher, and my digital footprint was about to become the most dangerous liability in a house built entirely on greed. The vulnerability that shattered my carefully constructed digital fortress did not stem from a sophisticated cyber intrusion. It was born from a much older, simpler human flaw. It was born from Greg and his chronic, desperate need for unearned cash. My brother-in-law presented himself to the suburban Pennsylvania neighborhood as a transitional entrepreneur navigating complex market fluctuations. The reality was far more pathetic. His golf outings and networking seminars were a thin veneer covering a severe, escalating sports betting addiction. Greg was drowning in offshore gambling debts, borrowing against Sarah's credit cards, and constantly hunting for liquid assets to cover his mounting losses. He operated with the frantic, predatory energy of a cornered animal, constantly scanning his environment for a weakness to exploit. That weakness materialized on a Thursday evening during a rare, chaotic disruption in my routine. The legal department at the University of Pennsylvania had just transmitted the preliminary acquisition documents to my secure inbox. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed reading the dense legal phrasing, my eyes tracing the formal valuation figure proposed by the Ivy League institution. $3.5 million. The sum was staggering, a string of zeros that represented the definitive end of my indentured servitude. Before I could process the gravity of the contract, a sharp, terrified cry echoed from the downstairs hallway. Jack had accidentally knocked a heavy ceramic vase off a console table. The sudden shattering noise of the impact triggered an immediate sensory cascade. I heard his frantic hyperventilating gasps. A severe dysregulation event required an immediate hydroregulation protocol. A specialized warm bath designed to reset his overwhelmed nervous system through deep, sustained water pressure. I jumped up from the mattress. In my rush to reach my nephew, I made a singular, catastrophic tactical error. I closed the lid of my laptop, putting the machine to sleep, but I failed to log out of the secure email client. Furthermore, the local machine password, the simple numeric code required to wake the screen, was Jack's date of birth, a predictable sequence I utilized for speed during pediatric emergencies. I spent the next 40 minutes kneeling on the hard bathroom tiles, guiding Jack through his breathing exercises, while the warm water slowly drained the panic from his rigid muscles. While I was occupied in the bathroom, Greg slipped into my bedroom. He routinely snooped through my meager belongings when I was distracted searching for stray $20 bills, misplaced gift cards, or anything he could pawn to fund his next wager. He found my laptop resting on the quilt. Assuming I might have stored my tutoring payment schedule on the desktop, he flipped open the lid and typed in the birth dates of his children until the screen unlocked. He did not find a schedule of $50 tutoring sessions. He found the unencrypted UPenn legal thread displayed in sharp, high-resolution text. Greg did not possess the intellect to comprehend the algorithmic architecture of MindSteps, but he possessed a gambler's instinct for spotting a payout. He read the header containing the university seal. He read the terms of the acquisition. He read the valuation figure, $3.5 million. A normal relative might have felt a surge of pride realizing the teenage dropout they had mocked was actually an unheralded genius. Greg felt nothing but a dark, consuming greed. This was the ultimate bailout, a fortune sitting on the mattress of the family servant. He utilized the wireless network connection to silently route the email thread to the laser printer in his downstairs home office. He secured the physical evidence of my empire and slipped out of my room, leaving behind a single devastating clue. I returned to my bedroom an hour later, carrying a pile of damp towels. The room appeared untouched, but a decade of surviving in a hostile environment had honed my situational awareness to a razor edge. I opened my laptop to resume reviewing the contracts. The screen illuminated. Right in the center of the display, hovering directly over the digital ink of the $3.5 million valuation, was a smudge. It was a greasy, distinct thumbprint left behind by someone who had been eating the delivery pizza Sarah ordered for dinner. A cold, heavy dread pooled in my stomach. I immediately accessed the administrative dashboard of the household wireless network. I pulled the router traffic logs. The data confirmed my fear. 10 minutes prior, my device had transmitted a 30-page document packet to Greg's office printer. The perimeter was breached. My family possessed the acquisition terms. I knew with absolute certainty they would not confront me directly. A direct confrontation would allow me to defend my intellectual property or simply walk out the front door. They operated through manipulation, consensus, and unified fronts. They would convene, assess the asset, and formulate a strategy to extract it. I pulled my old, cracked development tablet from beneath my mattress. I activated the internal microphone, initiated a remote recording application, and walked silently out into the second-floor hallway. I crept toward the heating register, situated directly above Sarah's home office. I slipped the thin tablet through the metal grate, resting it on the ductwork where it could capture the audio from the room below. I returned to my bedroom, plugged my headphones into my laptop, and listened to the live feed. The secret meeting was already underway. Greg had summoned Sarah, and my parents, Richard and Helen, had driven over under the guise of delivering some mail. The ambient noise of ice clinking in scotch glasses echoed through my headphones. "Look at the signature line," Greg was saying, his voice vibrating with a frantic, greedy excitement. "It is a legitimate offer from the Dean of Education at Penn. The software she has been tinkering with for Jack. They want to buy it." The rustling of heavy paper followed. A long, dense silence stretched across the audio feed as my parents and sister processed the magnitude of the wealth printed on the pages. "This is a fabrication," Sarah finally stated, her tone laced with heavy denial. Callie barely passed high school algebra before she withdrew. She lacks the capacity to engineer software for an Ivy League research hospital. "It is a scam." "It is not a scam," Sarah Richard countered, his voice lowering into a serious, calculating register. "Look at the routing numbers. Look at the institutional letterhead. The girl managed to build something functional." I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable pivot. I waited for my father to suggest congratulating me, to acknowledge that my years of silent labor had yielded a monumental achievement. The acknowledgement never came. The pivot was instantaneous and entirely sociopathic. "How do we secure the holding company?" Helen asked, her voice sharp and pragmatic, devoid of any maternal warmth. "If this institution is prepared to deposit those funds, we need to ensure the capital is directed into the appropriate family accounts. Callie is not equipped to manage wealth of this magnitude. She has no financial literacy. She is a dependent," Richard proclaimed, laying the foundation for their theft with his archaic traditionalist logic. He spoke with the unyielding authority of a patriarch delivering a sermon. "She resides under this roof. She consumes the food purchased by Greg and Sarah. She utilized the electricity and the broadband internet connection paid for by this household to write her code. Therefore, the product of her labor is not individual property. It is a family asset." The twisted justification hung in the air, a grotesque distortion of reality. They were erasing my 80-hour work weeks, my sleep deprivation, and my self-taught genius, replacing it all with the cost of their Wi-Fi router. "Precisely," Greg agreed eagerly. "She was acting as an agent of this house. The intellectual property rightfully belongs to the management of this family. I have the corporate infrastructure to handle an acquisition of this size. We just need her to sign the LLC transfer documents assigning ownership to my name." And if she refuses, Sarah asked, the first hint of tactical reality entering the conversation. "Callie has become stubborn lately. She might attempt to contact the university and finalize the deal independently." "She will not contact anyone," Richard stated coldly. "We do not ask for her signature. We require it. She is comfortable because she faces no real pressure. We remove her comfort. We remind her exactly how dependent she is on our charity. By the time we place the transfer documents in front of her, she will sign them simply to survive." I pulled the headphones away from my ears. The audio feed continued, detailing their sinister, meticulous plan to break my spirit. But I had heard enough. They were not just planning to steal my life's work. They were preparing to orchestrate my total psychological and financial ruin to ensure my compliance. I sat in the dark, staring at the greasy fingerprint on my screen. The quiet domestic drudgery of my existence had officially ended. I was now operating in a theater of war, and my family was preparing to initiate a brutal campaign of financial sabotage to starve me into submission. They believed I was a captive, helpless asset. They were about to discover the danger of cornering an architect who had already built her own escape hatch. The campaign of financial strangulation began the very next morning at exactly 6:30. I walked into the kitchen to prepare the children for school, expecting to find the usual weekly grocery deliveries stacked on the granite island. The counters were bare. I opened the stainless steel refrigerator. The shelves held only a half-empty jar of mustard, a carton of filtered water, and a single wilted bell pepper. The pantry was equally desolate. The specialized sensory-friendly snacks, the organic fruit purees, and the specific brand of pediatric nutritional formula Jack required for his dietary aversions were gone. Sarah walked into the kitchen wearing a pristine ivory blouse, buttoning her cuffs with practiced indifference. She did not look at the empty shelves. She poured her coffee from the automated espresso machine, her movements casual and unhurried. "Budgets are tight this quarter," Sarah stated, taking a slow sip from her ceramic mug. "Greg had a setback with his portfolio. I canceled the grocery subscription. You will need to figure out the meals for the kids this week. We all have to tighten our belts." She set her mug down, picked up her leather briefcase, and walked out the door. The cruelty of the tactic was breathtaking in its precision. Sarah was a regional vice president, earning a substantial executive salary. She had not canceled her premium espresso bean delivery or paused her weekly country club manicures. She had explicitly targeted the food supply of her own children, knowing with clinical certainty that I loved my niece and nephews too much to let them go hungry. The strategy was designed to force me into liquidating my immediate cash reserves. They knew I kept a small, unencrypted local checking account to pay the monthly tribute to Greg. By shifting the financial burden of the household onto my shoulders, they intended to drain that decoy account to zero, leaving me desperate, isolated, and highly pliable. The siege escalated rapidly throughout the week. On Wednesday afternoon, the director of the local youth soccer league called my cell phone. He informed me that Mason's registration payment had bounced, and he would not be allowed to play in the weekend tournament unless the balance was settled immediately. An hour later, Lily's piano instructor arrived at the front door, looking deeply uncomfortable, as she explained that Sarah had abruptly canceled the auto draft for her weekly lessons. I stood on the front porch watching the disappointment threaten to crush Lily's face. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my local debit card, and paid the instructor for a month in advance. I logged into the soccer league portal and cleared Mason's balance. Every transaction chipped away at my visible safety net. My local account balance plummeted from hundreds to double digits. I watched the numbers drop on my smartphone screen, understanding exactly what my family was doing. They were constructing a cage of manufactured poverty around me, assuming my limited tutoring funds were my only source of capital. By Friday evening, the situation reached a critical threshold. The household supply of Jack's specialized nutritional formula was empty. Without that specific caloric input, his blood sugar would destabilize, leading to a severe sensory overload and inevitable regression. I drove my aging sedan to the upscale grocery market on the edge of our Pennsylvania suburb. The store was a temple of excess, filled with imported cheeses, organic produce, and wealthy traditionalists pushing polished silver carts. I navigated the bright, sterile aisles, picking up 2 heavy plastic jugs of the pediatric formula, a loaf of bread, and a jar of peanut butter. I carried the items to the checkout lane. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, relentless frequency. The cashier, a teenager wearing a green apron, scanned the items. The total appeared on the digital display, $48.15. I pulled my blue debit card from my canvas tote bag and slid it into the chip reader. I stared at the small screen, waiting for the approving green check mark. The machine beeped, a sharp, negative tone. The screen flashed red text, insufficient funds. The cashier sighed, a sound of profound teenage impatience. It declined, he said, his voice carrying clearly to the woman standing in line behind me. My stomach dropped, a cold stone sinking into my pelvis. I asked him to try it again. He pressed a button on his register, and I reinserted the card. The same sharp beep echoed in the quiet checkout lane. The red text glared at me. The woman behind me shifted her weight, her expensive leather handbag rustling against her silk coat. I felt the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. My local account was entirely empty. The financial trap my parents and sister had set was now a tangible physical barrier. I could not leave the formula. Jack needed it to survive the night. I pulled the tote bag onto the small metal shelf below the card reader. I unzipped the inner lining, plunging my hands into the dark fabric. My fingers scraped against loose change, discarded receipts, and old mints. I pulled out a handful of silver and copper coins, dropping them onto the pristine black conveyor belt. Quarters, dimes, nickels. The cashier stared at the pile of loose change, his expression shifting from impatience to raw pity. I kept digging. I unearthed crumpled single-dollar bills, smoothing out the wrinkled paper under the harsh grocery store lighting. I counted out the money, coin by painful coin, the cold metal pressing against my trembling fingers. I pushed the exact total toward the teenager. He swept the coins into his drawer without speaking, handed me a receipt, and bagged the heavy jugs. I carried the plastic bags out into the freezing parking lot, the physical weight of the formula matching the heavy, suffocating isolation pressing down on my chest. The financial strangulation was only the first phase of their war. The psychological gaslighting arrived the very next morning. I took the children to the neighborhood park to burn off their weekend energy. The playground was a central hub for the local social hierarchy, a place where the affluent mothers gathered to perform their domestic success. Usually they ignored me, treating the dropout nanny as an invisible fixture. Today the atmosphere was distinctly altered. As I sat on a wooden bench watching Mason climb the jungle gym, a neighbor named Mrs. Gable approached. She was the secretary of my mother's neighborhood association, a woman whose entire existence revolved around suburban gossip. She did not sit down. She stood, hovering over my bench, adopting an exaggerated, gentle tone, the kind of voice reserved for approaching a wounded animal. "Helen told us what you are going through, Callie," Mrs. Gable murmured, clasping her hands together in a theatrical display of concern. "It is such a tragedy when the mind breaks under pressure. We are all praying for you to find the psychiatric help you need." I looked up from the wood chips. I asked her exactly what my mother had told her. Mrs. Gable offered a sad, patronizing smile. "Helen mentioned your delusions, how you have been staying awake all night inventing stories about being a software engineer, claiming you are talking to universities. It is classic grandiose behavior. You are so lucky your parents and your sister are willing to shelter you while you are so mentally unwell." The precision of my mother's malice became horrifyingly clear. Helen had initiated a preemptive whisper campaign across their entire Pennsylvania social circle. She was systematically planting the narrative that I was suffering from severe psychiatric distress and delusions of grandeur. The strategy was flawless. If I attempted to tell anyone that I had built a multi-million-dollar application, or if I tried to scream that my family was stealing my intellectual property, the entire community would simply nod with pity. They had been primed to view my truth as the tragic rambling of a broken mind. Helen was destroying my credibility, ensuring that if I tried to speak out, no one would ever believe me. I sat on the wooden bench, the cold autumn wind biting through my thin sweater. I was entirely isolated. My visible cash reserves were bankrupt. My public reputation was reduced to clinical insanity. My family believed they had successfully backed me into a dark, inescapable corner, stripping away every resource until I had nothing left but their forced charity. They did not know about the encrypted offshore dashboard. They did not know that the university acquisition funds were real, and they did not realize that I had chosen to let my local account hit zero to maintain their false sense of victory. I endured the humiliation of the loose change and the pity of the neighborhood gossips, because a cornered architect is the most dangerous opponent on the board. The trap was closing, but it was their trap, not mine. That evening, the final phase of their operation commenced. Sarah walked into the kitchen wearing a fresh corporate suit, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. She tossed it onto the island counter. "Clear your schedule for tomorrow night," Sarah ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Helen is hosting a formal dinner at the Wellington Steakhouse downtown. The entire extended family will be there. We have some structural household changes to discuss, and you are required to attend." I looked at the envelope. The Wellington was the most intimidating, exclusive private dining room in the city. They were bringing the entire family to serve as an audience, applying maximum social pressure in a high-stakes environment. The ambush was set. They intended to use my manufactured poverty and their fabricated psychiatric narrative to force a coerced signature, stealing my empire right in front of the soup course. I picked up the envelope, my face an unreadable mask of submission. I told my sister I would be there. The Wellington Steakhouse occupied the ground floor of a historic bank building in the center of the Philadelphia financial district. It was an institution designed to project power, featuring dark mahogany walls, vaulted ceilings, and lighting so dim it felt like a subterranean vault. I parked my aging sedan 6 blocks away in the freezing autumn rain to avoid the exorbitant valet fee, walking the rest of the way with my thin coat pulled tight across my chest. When I arrived at the host stand, the maitre d' looked down his nose at my damp hair and faded dress, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and designer gowns filling the main dining floor. I gave him my father's last name. His demeanor shifted into crisp professionalism, and he guided me past the crowded tables toward the back of the restaurant. We reached a set of heavy brass-studded oak doors. The maitre d' pulled one open, gesturing for me to step inside the private dining room. The trap was already fully populated. My mother had not just invited Sarah and Greg, she had summoned the entire extended family. My Uncle Thomas, my Aunt Susan, and 3 of my older cousins sat around a long, polished wooden table set for 18 guests. Crystal water goblets caught the low light, casting fractured reflections across the pristine white tablecloth. As I walked into the room, all conversation ceased. 15 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I felt the immediate, suffocating weight of my mother's whisper campaign. My relatives did not look at me with familial warmth or simple indifference. They looked at me with profound, performative pity. Aunt Susan tilted her head, her face settling into an expression of tragic concern. Uncle Thomas offered a tight, uncomfortable nod. They had all been thoroughly briefed by Helen. They truly believed they were attending an intervention for a delusional, destitute young woman whose mind had fractured under the strain of domestic life. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, isolated from the center of power. Sarah and Greg sat near my father, projecting an aura of weary patience. There was one anomaly in the seating arrangement. Greg sat next to a man I had never seen before. The stranger wore a gray suit that looked expensive from a distance, but revealed its cheap synthetic material under the ambient lighting. He smelled strongly of strong cologne and stale tobacco. He did not speak to anyone, merely sipping his ice water while keeping a close, predatory watch on the room. My father cleared his throat, welcoming the family and thanking them for gathering on such short notice. He ordered an array of expensive appetizers for the table, speaking to the waiters with the casual authority of a man spending someone else's money. He knew the bill would eventually be paid by the multi-million-dollar acquisition he intended to steal from me before dessert. The first course arrived. Silver platters of oysters, beef carpaccio, and roasted marrow bones were placed along the center of the table. The disconnect between the extravagant food and my current reality was jarring. Less than 24 hours ago, I had emptied my pockets of loose copper coins just to buy pediatric formula for my nephew. Now I was surrounded by a feast funded by the illusion of my sister's corporate success. I placed a single oyster on my plate and remained silent, playing the role they expected. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze lowered, projecting the image of a broken, exhausted dependent. Helen leaned across the table, initiating the psychological theater. She asked me if I had been sleeping well, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She told the table that I had been spending far too much time locked in my room staring at screens, suggesting it was unhealthy for my fragile state of mind. Aunt Susan chimed in, offering the phone number of a therapist she knew, saying it was important to seek help when reality became too difficult to handle. The gaslighting was seamless. They were establishing my mental incompetence on the record in front of numerous witnesses, ensuring that whatever happened next would be viewed through the lens of my supposed insanity. If I signed a document tonight, the family would testify that it was for my own good. If I refused, they would claim I was having an episode. I thanked Aunt Susan quietly and took a sip of my water. I let them build their false narrative, knowing that an ambush only works if the target is unaware of the terrain. The waiters returned to clear the empty appetizer plates. The clatter of porcelain against silver echoed in the quiet room. Once the table was clear, Richard made a subtle, sharp gesture toward the maitre d' standing near the entrance. The maitre d' nodded, stepped out into the main restaurant, and pulled the heavy oak doors shut. The brass latch clicked into place with a definitive, echoing thud. The ambient noise of the main dining floor vanished. The private room turned instantly frigid. The social pleasantries evaporated, replaced by a dense, predatory tension. The trap was now physically closed. Richard stood up from his chair at the head of the table. He buttoned his suit jacket, looking down the length of the mahogany wood directly at me. "We brought the family together tonight because we are facing a critical transition," my father announced. His voice was cold, carrying the tone of a corporate executive terminating an employee. "Callista, your behavior recently has become erratic. You have isolated yourself. You have invented stories about digital companies and universities. We love you, but we can no longer allow you to drift without structure." He paused, letting his words sink into the silent room. The extended family nodded in solemn agreement, entirely captivated by the performance. Sarah works tirelessly to provide your shelter, Richard continued, gesturing toward my sister. Greg is building a future for his children. You have contributed nothing but instability. However, Greg has graciously offered to take over the management of your little software project. He will integrate it into his holding company, ensuring it is handled properly and perhaps mitigating some of the financial burden you place on this family. It was a masterful presentation. He had framed a multi-million-dollar theft as a generous act of charity. Greg leaned back in his chair looking incredibly smug. He gestured to the stranger sitting beside him. "This is Mr. Caldwell," Greg said, his voice laced with unearned confidence. "He is my legal counsel. He has prepared the necessary paperwork to formalize the transition. It is a simple transfer of assets." Mr. Caldwell did not introduce himself. He unzipped a thick leather briefcase resting on the floor beside his chair. The sound of the zipper was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a dense stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He placed the stack onto the pristine white tablecloth. He flipped to the final page, revealing a line demanding my signature, assigning total ownership of the Mindsteps architecture and the anonymous Delaware Corporation to Greg's personal holding company. The extended family watched with bated breath, expecting me to weep, to apologize, and to gratefully surrender my delusions to the men of the house. They intended to use the crushing weight of their collective authority, the opulent setting, and my manufactured poverty to terrify me into submission. Mr. Caldwell reached into his suit pocket. He pulled out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. He set it down on the tablecloth next to the legal documents. Using his index finger, he slowly slid the pen across the smooth white fabric, pushing it until it came to a rest exactly 1 inch from the edge of my dinner plate. The gold metal gleamed under the dim chandelier lighting. The silence in the room was absolute, waiting for the broken nanny to pick up the pen and sign away her entire existence. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of crisp Pennsylvania night where the autumn air made the glowing windows of the suburban mainline estates look like screens broadcasting perfect lives. Inside the Eugene household, the broadcast was a carefully managed illusion. 17-year-old Callista sat at the edge of the polished oak dining table. Her AP cognitive psychology textbook lay open, the margins filled with her dense, neat notes. She held a 4.0 grade point average at the state's most rigorous science magnet school, her sights set quietly on the Ivy League institutions resting just a few dozen miles east in Philadelphia. In this pocket of the state, however, academic prestige was only valued if it could be immediately monetized. Her father, Richard, cleared his throat from the head of the table. He wore a crisp, branded golf polo, the uniform of a man who equated middle management corporate titles with divine right. Beside him sat Helen Callista's mother, smoothing the condensation on her wine glass. Opposite Callista sat her older sister Sarah and Sarah's husband Greg. The air in the dining room felt thin, suffocating. Greg's third independent sales venture had officially folded that morning. The mortgage on their sprawling, out-of-budget colonial home was due. Meanwhile, Sarah had just been handed a regional director title at a local logistics firm, a role demanding 60 hours a week. They had 3 children under the age of 8 and 0 liquid capital for daycare. The family required a bailout, and Richard had already done the math. "We are making a structural pivot," Richard announced, folding his hands over his placemat. He didn't look at Callista's textbook. He looked right through it. Sarah's promotion requires her full attention. Greg needs time to network and rebuild his portfolio. Childcare is an expense they cannot carry. Callista felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. "I can pick the kids up after my lab period," she offered cautiously. "No," Richard said, his tone flat and unyielding. "You are withdrawing from the magnet program tomorrow. You will move into the spare room at Sarah's house and watch the children full-time." The words hung over the table, rigid and heavy. Callista stared at her father, waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. "Withdraw, Dad. I have early admissions testing next month. I'm applying for the neurobehavioral track." "A piece of paper," Richard interrupted, waving a hand as if swatting away a fly. Theoretical nonsense. Sarah has a real future in the corporate world. You don't. Do your part for this family. Helen reached across the table, offering a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's just the pragmatic choice, Callie. You can always get your GED online later. Sarah's career is tangible. We all have to sacrifice. There was no negotiation. In the Eugene family, roles were assigned by perceived utility, and Callista's utility was reduced to free domestic labor. Sarah didn't even look up from her phone, already answering an email, her assent secured by her sister's immediate erasure. 2 hours later, the house was silent. Callista sat on the floor of her bedroom with the lights off. Beside her sat an empty leftover diaper box Greg had brought over earlier that week. She picked up her heavy psychology textbook, her fingers tracing the glossy cover. The room smelled faintly of rain and the cardboard dust of the Pampers box. Without shedding a tear, she lowered the textbook into the box, followed by her biology notes and her advanced statistics binders. She packed away her future in the dark, sealing it shut with a strip of clear packing tape. Tomorrow, she would trade her classroom for her sister's chaotic living room, inheriting a toddler, a preschooler, and a 7-year-old. But as she pressed the tape down, tracing the sharp edge of the cardboard, a quiet, methodical resolve settled into her chest. They could take her out of the school, but they had no idea how a neglected environment was about to become her perfect laboratory. The heavy gold fountain pen rested on the pristine white tablecloth. It was positioned exactly 1 inch from the edge of my dinner plate. The private dining room inside the Wellington Steakhouse held a silence so dense it felt like physical pressure. 15 relatives stared at me from around the long mahogany table. My mother pressed a linen napkin to her cheek, performing the role of the tragic, exhausted savior for her captive audience. My father sat tall at the head of the table, his posture projecting unyielding authority. Greg crossed his arms, wearing a smirk of unearned victory. Sarah looked at her manicured fingernails, waiting for the unpleasantness to conclude so she could order dessert. They expected tears. They expected my shoulders to shake, my voice to crack, and my spirit to finally fracture under the weight of their orchestrated extortion. They anticipated the broken nanny reaching for the pen, surrendering my software, my anonymous corporation, and my entire future to erase a fabricated debt. I looked down at the invoice Greg had produced. It was printed on cheap, branded stationery from a real estate brokerage he had bankrupted 3 years prior. The itemized charges were laughable: room board, internet access, and domestic sponsorship, totaling $150,000. I did not reach for the pen. A sound escaped my throat. It began low in my chest, a quiet rumble that rose into the quiet room. It was a laugh, cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of humor. The sound paralyzed the table. Helen dropped her linen napkin. The artificial tears vanished from her eyes, replaced by genuine alarm. Richard narrowed his gaze, the confident set of his jaw slipping into confusion. Greg uncrossed his arms, leaning forward, the smirk faltering on his lips. They had run scenarios for panic, for anger, and for surrender. They had not prepared for amusement. "I love invoices," I said. My voice was calm, cutting through the frigid air of the private dining room like a scalpel. I reached down into my canvas tote bag resting on the floor. I bypassed the spare diapers and the wet wipes, grasping the smooth material of a meticulously organized, leather-bound portfolio. I lifted it and placed it directly onto the white tablecloth. The heavy thud of the binder echoed against the wood-paneled walls. I opened the leather cover. Inside sat a stack of documents printed on thick, high-quality parchment paper. I extracted the top sheet and slid it across the table, positioning it perfectly over the cheap real estate stationery Greg had used for his extortion demand. "Let us discuss the market rate for domestic sponsorship," I suggested, keeping my tone conversational and light. I tapped the top page of my document. It was a forensic, day-by-day ledger detailing 9 years of unpaid labor. I had not billed them at the rate of a teenage babysitter. I had utilized the standard Pennsylvania market rate for a specialized neurobehavioral nanny managing a high-needs child. 80 hours a week, I explained, looking directly into Sarah's wide, stunned eyes. 52 weeks a year, 108 months. Factoring in overnight hazard pay for severe sensory meltdowns, 0 health benefits, and uncompensated educational tutoring, the itemized total comes to $456,000. I even applied a generous familial discount. The color began to drain from Richard's face. The patriarchal authority he wore like a shield was cracking under the weight of cold, irrefutable math. But an invoice is only as strong as the financial solvency of the client. I continued my gaze sweeping past my immediate family to the extended relatives watching the spectacle. Aunt Susan sat frozen, her water glass halfway to her mouth. Uncle Thomas was leaning forward, his eyes darting between the ledger and my face. They had been invited to witness my humiliation. I decided to give them a much more accurate show. I pulled a secondary stack of folders from the leather portfolio. I handed the first folder to the right, passing it down the long table toward my aunt and uncle. I handed the second folder to the left, directing it toward my older cousins. "What are these?" Aunt Susan asked, her voice trembling slightly as she opened the manila cover. "Those are the true accounting records of the corporate success my mother has been boasting about for the past decade," I replied smoothly. Uncle Thomas flipped to the second page of his packet. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. He adjusted his reading glasses, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. A heavy, uncomfortable silence blanketed the room as the extended family read the truth. Chapter 7. Uncle Thomas whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. The color rapidly drained from Greg's face as his uncle read his bankruptcy details aloud. "You filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection 4 months ago," Greg stammered, producing a pathetic, wet sound. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "That is a strategic corporate restructuring, Thomas. You do not understand the commercial real estate sector. It is a temporary liquidity issue. It is a total liquidation of assets due to offshore sports betting debts," I corrected him, refusing to let the lie stand. "The documentation includes the itemized creditor lists. He owes over $200,000 to various unregulated gaming syndicates. The house you all admire is leveraged to the breaking point." A shocked whisper rippled through the cousins on the opposite side of the table. They were looking at Sarah's financial disclosures. 3 separate revolving credit lines, my cousin whispered, passing the sheet to her husband. Maxed out. And a second mortgage taken out just to cover the country club initiation fees and the luxury vehicle leases. Sarah stared at the tablecloth, her posture rigid, her face burning with a bright, feverish red. The flawless ivory blouse and the regional vice president title could no longer conceal the rot underneath. Her pristine corporate image, the very foundation of my parents' social standing, was being dissected and exposed as a colossal, unsustainable fraud. I looked at my mother. Helen was clutching the edge of her seat. The performative savior routine was dead. She was watching her entire curated universe collapse in front of the specific audience she had spent 10 years trying to impress. The wealthy legacy families might not be in the room, but the family gossip network was far more lethal. By tomorrow morning, the entire Pennsylvania suburb would know that the Eugene family was destitute. "You thought you could drag me into this room, threaten me with a fake debt, and steal my intellectual property to patch the holes in a sinking ship?" I said, my voice resonating with unshakable authority. "You thought my lack of a diploma meant a lack of intelligence. You confused my silence for stupidity." Richard finally found his voice. It was not the booming tone of a patriarch, but the ragged gasp of a desperate man.
"You stole those documents," he accused,
pointing a trembling finger at me.
"That is confidential financial information."
"You hacked into their accounts. That is a federal crime." I smiled, the expression containing zero warmth. "Public records, Dad. Bankruptcy filings and property liens are matters of public record in this state. You just have to know where to look." I spent 9 years raising those children while you all performed for the neighbors. I had plenty of time to learn how to read a balance sheet. The reversal of power was spectacular. The orchestrated ambush had backfired with devastating precision. They had intended to weaponize public humiliation to permanently cement me at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Instead, I had utilized their own stage, their own audience, and their own timing to execute a flawless forensic counterstrike. The illusion of the successful corporate sister and the benevolent parents was reduced to ash on the white tablecloth. The extended relatives were no longer looking at me with pity. They were staring at Sarah, Greg, Richard, and Helen with raw, undisguised disgust. The facade was shattered, and the true parasites of the family were exposed to the light. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the realization of their total ruin. Greg stared at his empty water goblet, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Sarah covered her face with her hands, unable to meet the eyes of her cousins. My parents sat frozen, trapped in the wreckage of their own arrogance. However, the danger was not entirely neutralized. The stranger sitting next to Greg shifted in his chair. Mr. Caldwell, the sleazy legal counsel they had hired to legitimize their extortion, recognized that his clients had just lost control of the room. He realized the social pressure tactic had failed spectacularly, and the target was far more sophisticated than he had been led to believe. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen, slipping it back into his suit pocket, and placed his hands flat on the table, preparing to escalate the confrontation from a family dispute into a vicious legal war. The private dining room was submerged in the heavy aftermath of exposed secrets. My family sat paralyzed around the long mahogany table, their pristine social facades torn to shreds, leaving nothing but the undeniable reality of their financial ruin. The extended relatives stared at them with naked disgust. The orchestrated ambush had collapsed. However, the man sitting next to Greg was not constrained by family shame. Mr. Caldwell, the hired legal counsel, recognized that his clients had lost control of the narrative. He was a predator who operated in the murky waters of suburban litigation, a man accustomed to bullying terrified dependents into submission. He did not care about Sarah hiding her credit card debt or Greg plunging into bankruptcy. He only cared about his percentage of the acquisition payout. He placed his hands flat on the white tablecloth, leaning forward to project dominance. "Let us return to the matter at hand," Mr. Caldwell announced, his voice slicing through the stunned silence. He spoke with the manufactured deep baritone of a man trying to sound authoritative. "These personal financial disclosures are unfortunate, but they have zero bearing on the legal status of the intellectual property in question." I turned my attention to the attorney. I waited, giving him the floor, allowing him to construct his own trap. "You built a software application while residing under a roof financed by my client," the attorney continued, gesturing toward Greg. "You utilized equipment, utilities, and resources provided by this household. Under standard equitable distribution principles in this state, that creates a shared domestic enterprise. You do not own that code outright." I remained perfectly still, resting my hands in my lap. "If you refuse to sign the transfer documents tonight, I will be standing at the clerk window of the state courthouse at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," Mr. Caldwell threatened, his eyes narrowing into a cold glare. "I will file an emergency ex parte injunction. I will freeze every digital asset, every bank account, and every cloud server associated with your application." He paused, letting the threat of a total operational shutdown hang in the air. Richard lifted his chin, a faint glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. Sarah sat up slightly straighter. They believed their hired gun had finally found the vulnerability they needed. "You mentioned an Ivy League institution earlier," Mr. Caldwell said, offering a patronizing smile. "Universities are highly risk-averse entities. They do not acquire contested intellectual property. The moment I file that injunction, their legal department will terminate your acquisition deal immediately. They will walk away, and you will spend the next 5 years tied up in brutal, exhausting discovery hearings. I will bleed your resources dry until you are begging to sign this transfer just to pay your legal fees. The strategy was textbook extortion. He was threatening to kill the UPenn deal by tying the software to a messy, prolonged domestic lawsuit. He assumed I was a naive 26-year-old who would panic at the mention of court injunctions and frozen servers. He thought his cheap gray suit and his legal jargon were enough to break my resolve. He did not understand the architecture of the board we were playing on. I reached into my leather portfolio one final time. I did not pull out another financial ledger or a bankruptcy filing. I extracted a single thick envelope crafted from heavy linen paper. I opened the flap and withdrew a pristine document. I did not slide this paper toward my father or my sister. I pushed it directly across the center of the table, past the crystal water goblets, stopping right in front of Mr. Caldwell. "Read the header," I instructed. My voice was devoid of anger, echoing with cold, unyielding certainty. The attorney glanced down at the paper. His patronizing smile faltered the instant his eyes registered the intricate embossed seal pressed into the top margin. It was the official crest of the University of Pennsylvania Corporate Legal Division. Anticipating the boundless greed of my relatives, I executed a defensive maneuver 3 days ago, I explained to the silent room. I knew Greg would monitor my network traffic. I knew my parents would attempt to leverage my living situation to claim ownership. Therefore, I removed the asset from the battlefield entirely. Mr. Caldwell picked up the document. His hands were beginning to tremble. "That paper is a time-stamped, notarized transfer of intellectual property." I continued, my words landing like hammer strikes. On Tuesday afternoon, I legally assigned the entirety of the MindSteps software, the source code, the medical user database, and the Delaware corporate entity into an irrevocable blind trust. I watched the color drain from the attorney's face as he read the dense legal phrasing. "The sole beneficiary of that trust is the University of Pennsylvania Educational Technology Incubator," I stated. "I am merely the salaried director of the initiative. I do not personally own the asset anymore. The university owns it. The transition is legally finalized, registered, and secured by their institutional attorneys." The gravity of his error was crashing down upon him. "You thought you could file a frivolous injunction in a local state court to intimidate a high school dropout," I told him smoothly, leaning forward to ensure he heard every single syllable. "You thought you could bleed me dry. But you are not suing a suburban nanny anymore. If you file that motion tomorrow morning, you are threatening to sue the Ivy League." The silence in the private dining room deepened, taking on a terrifying, suffocating quality. "You are threatening to place an injunction against an endowment worth $20 billion, I whispered, delivering the final fatal blow. "You are threatening a legal department employing hundreds of the most ruthless corporate litigators on the Eastern Seaboard. If you attempt to freeze their medical research asset to extort money for a bankrupt sports gambler, they will not just defeat your injunction, they will sanction you. They will file malicious prosecution charges. They will strip you of your license, and they will obliterate your practice before the weekend." Mr. Caldwell stopped reading. His skin had turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. He swallowed hard, the sound audible across the table. He understood the hierarchy of the legal world. He was a bottom-feeding predator accustomed to bullying vulnerable individuals. He had just walked into a trap, threatening to initiate a war with an apex institutional powerhouse that could swat him out of existence without breaking a sweat. He realized Greg had either lied to him or monumentally failed to comprehend the reality of the UPenn acquisition. The attorney did not offer a counterargument. He did not attempt to negotiate. Survival instinct overrode his desire for a payout. He dropped the notarized transfer document back onto the white tablecloth as if it were burning his fingers. He reached for his leather briefcase resting on the floor. He swept his stack of extortion paperwork off the table, shoving the pages hastily into the dark interior of the bag. "What are you doing?" Greg demanded, his voice cracking with sudden raw panic. "We have a verbal contract. You said the domestic sponsorship angle was bulletproof." Mr. Caldwell glared at my brother-in-law, his expression twisting into pure, unadulterated fury. "You misrepresented the asset," the lawyer hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing the attention of the extended family members watching the spectacle. You told me she was an unrepresented dependent. You failed to disclose that the intellectual property was already secured by institutional counsel. You cannot just leave, Richard ordered, trying to summon his patriarchal authority. But the command sounded hollow and weak. We are your clients. You are a liability, Mr. Caldwell shot back, securing the brass latches on his bag. This constitutes a severe ethical violation. I will not risk disbarment to cover your gambling debts. Our association is permanently terminated. Do not contact my office again. The lawyer stood up. He did not look at me. He turned his back on the family he had been hired to protect and walked swiftly toward the heavy oak doors. He grabbed the brass handle, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the bustling, noisy atmosphere of the main restaurant floor. The heavy door swung shut behind him. The metallic click of the latch snapping into place echoed like a gunshot in the dead, silent room. He was gone. The sudden departure of their legal shield left my family entirely naked. They had no leverage, no authority, and no threats left to deploy. The manufactured debt was exposed as a desperate fraud. The psychological gaslighting had failed. Their hired gun had fled the room in terror. They were sitting in a private dining room at the Wellington Steakhouse, surrounded by relatives who now viewed them with profound disgust, facing a woman who wielded the monumental legal and financial power of the state elite academic institution. Richard stared at the empty space where the lawyer had been sitting. Helen covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Greg buried his face in his palms, realizing his last chance to escape his offshore creditors had just walked out the door. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying new understanding. The obedient, silent sister she had treated like disposable property for 9 years had systematically dismantled her entire universe. The checkmate was absolute. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, watching the empire of their arrogance burn to the ground. The victory was comprehensive, but the night was not quite over. My smartphone, resting quietly in the hidden pocket of my dress, was about to introduce the ultimate, undeniable validation of my triumph right into the center of their humiliation. The private dining room inside the Wellington Steakhouse transformed into a vacuum the moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the fleeing attorney. The air grew stagnant, thick with the unbreathable tension of a collapsed empire. The grand orchestrated ambush had dissolved into a spectacular display of self-inflicted ruin. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, observing the wreckage with cold, detached precision. My father stared at the empty chair where his legal shield had been sitting just moments prior. Richard seemed to age 10 years in a matter of seconds. The rigid, patriarchal posture he always maintained crumpled, leaving a hollow shell of a man who realized his authority held zero currency in the real world. Helen refused to meet anyone's gaze. She kept her eyes fixed on her untouched plate of beef carpaccio, her breathing shallow and uneven. She knew her carefully constructed suburban monarchy was dead. The extended relatives sitting across from her would ensure the neighborhood gossip network feasted on the details of her fraudulent wealth by sunrise. Greg looked physically ill. He rested his elbows on the white tablecloth, burying his face in his hands. His offshore gambling debts were no longer a hidden secret waiting for a magical bailout. They were public knowledge, documented on the parchment paper scattered around the crystal water goblets. Sarah sat frozen beside him. The pristine corporate executive image she had wielded like a weapon against me for 9 years was shattered. She was drowning in revolving credit lines and secondary mortgages tethered to a bankrupt husband and stripped of the unpaid domestic labor that made her career possible. They had brought me into this opulent space to break my spirit. They believed poverty and isolation would render me compliant. Instead, they found themselves cornered, stripped of their leverage, and drowning in their own financial incompetence. The silence stretched heavy and profound. No one dared to speak. The extended family members remained perfectly still, unwilling to interrupt the terrifying quiet that followed the execution of my forensic counterstrike. Then, A sudden, sharp vibration shattered the stillness. The sound originated from the hidden pocket of my dark dress. I reached into the fabric and withdrew my smartphone. I placed the device flat onto the center of the mahogany table. The screen illuminated, casting a bright white glow against the dim, subterranean lighting of the private room. Every eye around the table shifted toward the glowing rectangle. The caller identification displayed a highly distinct, unmistakable crest. It was the official institutional seal of the University of Pennsylvania, accompanied by the bold text of the Central Administrative Offices. The timing was impeccable, a flawless synchronization of events that no fiction writer could construct. Just as my family absorbed the totality of their defeat, the very institution they revered above all others arrived to deliver the final verdict. I did not lift the phone to my ear. I reached out and tapped the green icon on the glass screen. I pressed the speakerphone button, setting the volume to its highest capacity. Callista, a warm, resonant voice, filled the dining room. It was Dr. Eris Thorne. His tone carried a profound, unmistakable respect, a stark contrast to the condescension and venom my family had directed at me mere minutes ago. The acoustics of the vaulted ceiling amplified his words, projecting his voice into every corner of the frozen space. "Good evening, Dr. Thorne," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "I apologize for the late hour." He continued, the audio crisp and pristine. "I am sitting in the executive boardroom with the Dean of Education. We wanted to contact you before the weekend commenced to convey our profound enthusiasm regarding the finalized transition." Another voice joined the connection. It was older, carrying the refined, authoritative cadence of elite academia. "Good evening, Callista," the dean said. The crisp, authoritative voice echoed off the crystal wine glasses resting on the white tablecloth, sending a subtle, ringing vibration through the room. The sound was the auditory manifestation of absolute power. "I want to personally welcome you to the institution. We have finalized the structural integration of your software architecture into our research hospital grid." "Thank you, Dean," I answered, allowing the conversation to unfold organically, knowing every syllable was acting as a knife twisting in the chests of my relatives. Dr. Thorne resumed speaking. "The institutional trust accounts have cleared the final compliance checks. The $3.5 million acquisition funds were wired into your secure blind trust at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The financial transfer is permanent and irreversible. We consider it a bargain for the clinical value your technology provides." I watched my sister flinch. Sarah closed her eyes tight, the muscles in her jaw jumping as the staggering monetary figure echoed through the room. $3.5 million. It was a sum of wealth she could not generate in a lifetime of corporate logistics, achieved by the sibling she had treated as disposable property. Greg lowered his hands from his face. He stared at the smartphone glowing on the table, his expression twisting into a grotesque mask of agony. The bailout he had desperately tried to steal was real. It was finalized, and it was forever beyond his reach. He was going to lose his house, his country club membership, and quite possibly his freedom to his offshore creditors, all while sitting inches away from the fortune he failed to capture. Furthermore, the dean interjected, his tone shifting into formal institutional validation. "The Board of Regents has officially ratified your appointment. We are honored to welcome you as the inaugural director of the Early Behavioral Tech Initiative. We have reviewed the underlying algorithms you designed for the pediatric sensory mapping. It is revolutionary. You are, without hyperbole, one of the most brilliant minds to enter this university in a decade." The praise fell upon the dining room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My parents had spent 9 years telling me I had no future. Richard had waved away my academic potential as theoretical nonsense. Helen had stood in front of a country club ballroom and publicly branded me a simple-minded dropout incapable of higher learning. They had built an entire social reality upon the foundational lie that I was worthless. Now they were forced to sit in agonizing silence and listen as the highest academic authority in the state dismantled that lie. They could not argue with the dean. They could not manipulate the Ivy League. They were compelled to witness my undeniable, absolute triumph broadcast directly into the heart of their humiliation. Uncle Thomas leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. He looked at my father, shaking his head in silent, profound judgment. Aunt Susan stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and newfound reverence. They recognized the monumental shift in the family hierarchy. The supposed broken dependent was a multi-million-dollar technological director, and the supposedly successful parents were destitute frauds. "We have prepared a dedicated laboratory space for your arrival on campus next week," Dr. Thorne stated, bringing the call toward its conclusion. "We look forward to introducing you to your graduate research team. Enjoy your weekend, Director Eugene. I will see you on Monday, Dr. Thorne. Good night." I reached forward and tapped the red icon. The screen went black. The call disconnected, cutting off the audio link to the university. The silence rushed back into the private dining room, but the texture of the quiet had fundamentally altered. It was no longer the tense, predatory silence of an ambush. It was the hollow, echoing quiet of a graveyard. I picked up the smartphone and slipped it back into the hidden pocket of my dark dress. I slowly gathered my forensic ledgers and the bankruptcy filings, placing the thick parchment pages back into the leather-bound portfolio. The physical movements were smooth, unhurried, and deliberate. No one tried to stop me. Richard did not raise his voice to demand obedience. Helen did not attempt to weave a new manipulative narrative. Sarah and Greg remained paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their defeat. They had been entirely stripped of their illusions, their wealth, and their perceived superiority. I closed the leather cover of the portfolio. The heavy thud resonated against the mahogany table, signaling the definitive end of my subjugation. The performance was over. The truth was established. My family had dragged me into this opulent fortress to execute a financial slaughter, only to find themselves locked inside a prison of their own making. I sat at the far end of the table, breathing in the cool, conditioned air of the restaurant. The victory was total and uncompromising. Yet the final act of severing the toxic familial chains required a physical departure, a deliberate exit that would leave them trapped with the consequences of their arrogance, starting with the exorbitant dinner bill resting on a silver tray near my father. The screen of my smartphone went dark, plunging the center of the mahogany table back into the dim, ambient lighting of the Wellington Steakhouse. I slid the device into the hidden pocket of my dress. The silence that settled over the private dining room was no longer the heavy, predatory stillness of an impending ambush. It was the suffocating, hollow quiet of a total collapse. I placed my palms flat against the pristine white tablecloth and pushed myself up from the heavy wooden chair. The simple friction of the chair legs scraping against the thick carpet echoed like thunder. As I stood, the physical dynamics of the room shifted permanently. For 9 years I had made myself small, curving my shoulders, keeping my gaze anchored to the floorboards, absorbing their insults and their demands. Now, standing at the far end of the long table, I occupied the space with the unyielding posture of a university director. The atmosphere parted for me, deferring to the new, undeniable authority I commanded. I looked down at the people who had tried to bury me. My father, Richard, was slouched in his seat at the head of the table. His pristine golf polo seemed to hang loosely on his frame. The dictatorial patriarch who had commanded my obedience an hour ago was gone, replaced by a terrified, bankrupt man facing the harsh judgment of his own siblings. Helen sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles stark white. Her carefully curated social monarchy lay in ruins. The wealthy traditionalists she sought to impress would soon hear every detail of her fraudulent empire from the cousins whispering at the other end of the table. Greg stared blankly at his empty crystal water goblet, his chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic increments. His offshore creditors were waiting, and the multi-million-dollar bailout he thought he could steal had evaporated into the digital ether. Then my gaze locked onto my sister. Sarah was pale, the foundation on her face failing to hide the stark terror blooming underneath. The pristine corporate executive image was a shattered shell. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, realizing the foundational pillar of her entire existence was walking away. "My shift is over," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of any residual anger, delivering a statement of pure, objective fact. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. "You will need to wake up at 5:30 tomorrow morning." I continued detailing the brutal reality of the motherhood she had avoided for nearly a decade. "Jack wakes up exactly at that time. He requires a highly specific transition period. You cannot rush him. You must use the blue plastic cup for his water, not the green one. The green cup will trigger a sensory meltdown." I watched the horror dawn in her eyes as the sheer volume of the labor she was about to inherit crystallized in her mind. "He likes his toast cut into triangles," I instructed, my tone adopting the clinical precision of a manual being handed to a new, inexperienced employee. "The crust must be removed seamlessly. If the bathwater is a single degree too hot, he will refuse to enter the tub. You cannot hire a standard teenage babysitter to manage his neurological needs, and you can no longer afford a specialized professional. You will have to cancel your morning corporate strategy meetings. You are going to learn what it costs to raise the child you ignored." Sarah gripped the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the fabric. The logistics firm would not tolerate a regional vice president who suddenly needed to be home every afternoon by 3 o'clock. The career she had built by standing on my neck was about to crumble under the weight of her own biological responsibilities. I reached down and picked up the thick parchment paper ledger I had extracted from my leather portfolio earlier. The forensic invoice detailing 9 years of unpaid childcare, totaling $456,000. I slid the document down the center of the polished wood, pushing it until it came to a rest directly in front of Richard and Helen. "I am leaving this here," I announced, addressing my parents. "I will not pursue litigation to collect this debt. We all know you do not possess the liquidity to pay it anyway. I am leaving it as a permanent physical reminder of the exact value you extracted from my youth. You can look at that number every time you pass the bank, or every time you struggle to pay the mortgage on a house you can no longer afford." Just as the heavy reality of the invoice settled over them, the brass latch on the oak doors clicked open. A young waiter, entirely oblivious to the monumental destruction that had occurred inside the private room, stepped through the entryway. He carried a small polished silver tray. Resting on the center of the tray was a sleek black leather checkbook. The financial tally for the opulent appetizers, the vintage wine, and the private room reservation fee. The waiter approached the head of the table. He offered a polite, professional smile and placed the black leather book gently on the tablecloth right next to my father's right hand. "Thank you for dining at the Wellington tonight," the waiter murmured, stepping back and retreating through the doorway. The irony was sharp and profound. Richard stared at the black leather checkbook as if it were a venomous predator preparing to strike. The family had orchestrated this lavish dinner, assuming they were celebrating the theft of a fortune. Now they were destitute frauds sitting in one of the most expensive restaurants in Philadelphia, staring at a bill they could not feasibly pay without triggering another declined credit card. I gathered my canvas tote bag from the floor, sliding the leather strap over my shoulder. I had one final task to execute before severing the toxic chain forever. I reached into the front pocket of my faded dress and retrieved a small, heavy object. It was a brass house key, the physical mechanism that granted me access to the suburban colonial where I had spent 9 years trapped in domestic servitude. It was the metal symbol of my captivity. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, moving past the silent, staring cousins, until I stood directly behind Sarah's chair. Resting near her right hand was a large crystal goblet filled with an expensive vintage red wine she had ordered at the beginning of the evening. The dark liquid remained entirely untouched. I held the brass key poised over the wide rim of the crystal glass. I did not say another word. I simply opened my fingers. The heavy metal dropped. It struck the surface of the dark wine with a sharp, resonant splash. The red liquid rippled outward, staining the brass, submerging the key at the bottom of the goblet. The sound was definitive, a final period placed at the end of a long, agonizing sentence. I turned my back on the people who had tried to bury me. I walked toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not wait for an apology they were incapable of giving, nor did I seek any further closure. The validation from the Ivy League dean and the forensic proof resting on their table provided all the closure I would ever need. I pushed the brass handle down. The door swung open, welcoming me into the vibrant, noisy atmosphere of the main dining floor. I stepped out of the private room, leaving Richard, Helen, Sarah, and Greg to navigate the terrifying new reality of their ruin. I left them to pay the exorbitant dinner bill. I left them to face the judgmental whispers of their extended relatives. I left them to drown in the consequences of their own boundless greed. I walked through the crowded restaurant, navigating past tables filled with patrons enjoying their Friday evening. The scent of roasted garlic and seared steaks filled the air. I nodded politely to the maitre d' as I passed the host stand, pushing through the heavy revolving glass doors at the front entrance. I stepped out onto the damp pavement of the Philadelphia Financial District. The autumn rain had stopped, leaving the city streets glistening under the glow of the amber streetlights. The crisp, cold night air hit my face, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and distant exhaust. It was a sharp, bracing sensation. I took a deep, deliberate breath, filling my lungs to their absolute capacity. For the first time in 9 years, there was no invisible weight pressing down on my chest. There was no schedule to memorize, no frantic demands to meet, and no condescending voices to endure. There was only the vast, open horizon of my own potential. I pulled my thin coat tighter around my shoulders and began to walk down the illuminated sidewalk, breathing in the intoxicating, unadulterated scent of total freedom. The late April sun poured through the arched Gothic windows of the historic university building, casting long, warm, geometric patterns across my polished mahogany desk. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the private dining room closed behind me. The transition from a windowless suburban laundry room to an elite corner office on the University of Pennsylvania campus felt less like a career change and more like waking up from a decade-long fever dream. I sat back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of black coffee. The bitter, rich flavor grounded me in the present moment. Across the room, 3 brilliant graduate researchers were projecting a new sequence of behavioral data onto a digital whiteboard. They were analyzing the latest rollout of the MindSteps architecture, which the research hospital had recently deployed across 50 pediatric clinics on the eastern seaboard. I watched a young doctoral candidate named David point to a descending trend line on the graph. He explained how the updated predictive loop had successfully mitigated sensory overloads in 90% of their severe clinical trial subjects. He spoke to me not with the condescension my family had wielded, but with profound professional reverence. I offered a few structural adjustments to his code, praising his analytical approach. The students nodded eagerly, taking rapid notes. I was fostering an environment built on mutual respect and intellectual curiosity, deliberately rejecting the toxic transactional hierarchy I had survived. When the research team gathered their tablets and exited the office, the heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the serene quiet of my sanctuary. I turned my chair toward the window, looking out over the sprawling, manicured green lawns of the Ivy League institution. Students walked along the brick pathways carrying heavy backpacks, their entire lives stretching out before them. I had finally claimed my rightful place among them. Across the state, the stark contrast to my sunlit reality was unfolding in a brutal, predictable sequence of self-inflicted destruction. The performative empire my parents and sister had so ruthlessly guarded had crumbled into dust. The foundational pillar of their illusion was my silent, unpaid labor. Once that pillar was removed, the heavy roof of their actual responsibilities collapsed directly onto their heads. Sarah lasted less than 3 weeks in her regional vice president role. Without an invisible servant to manage the grueling domestic logistics, her flawless corporate schedule shattered. She was forced to wake up at dawn to handle the children, a task she had outsourced for nearly a decade. She quickly discovered that Jack did not care about her executive title or her tailored suits. When she handed him his morning water in the wrong-colored plastic cup, he spiraled into a severe sensory meltdown that lasted for 2 hours. She had no algorithmic tablet to soothe him, no hydroregulation protocols, and 0 maternal patience. Her unexcused absences at the logistics firm multiplied. She missed critical strategy meetings to wait in elementary school pickup lines. She snapped at senior partners during conference calls because she was operating on 3 hours of sleep. The corporate world, which my father always claimed was the only tangible measure of human worth, proved entirely unforgiving. Sarah was given an ultimatum and ultimately forced to resign. She traded her prestigious corner office for a remote entry-level consulting position, taking a staggering pay cut just to remain home and manage the chaos she had previously ignored. The loss of Sarah's executive salary removed the final financial safety net protecting her husband. Greg could no longer siphon her income to cover his minimum payments. His offshore gambling creditors escalated their collection efforts, filing formal legal judgments that froze his remaining domestic accounts. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on their sprawling suburban colonial home. The descent was swift and humiliating. The luxury vehicles were quietly repossessed in the middle of the night. A cheap, generic real estate sign appeared on their manicured front lawn, signaling a desperate short sale to the entire neighborhood. They were forced to pack their belongings into rented cardboard boxes and move into a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the industrial side of the county. The wealthy traditionalist neighbors watched their exodus from behind drawn curtains, whispering about the downfall over their morning coffee. My mother, Helen, proved entirely incapable of accepting the reality of her shattered social monarchy. The neighborhood gossip network had feasted on the truth of their bankruptcy and the spectacular failure of their extortion attempt at the steakhouse. To combat the overwhelming public humiliation, Helen resorted to the only defense mechanism she knew. She attempted to rewrite history. She continued attending her country club luncheons, sitting among the shrinking circle of women who still tolerated her presence. She would stir her iced tea, force a bright, brittle smile, and loudly steer the conversation toward the University of Pennsylvania. She began bragging about her brilliant, gifted daughter, who was running a multi-million-dollar technological initiative at the Ivy League institution. She tried to claim my victory as her own, weaving a fictional narrative where she had nurtured my genius and supported my unconventional educational path from the very beginning. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but her desperate performance contained a fatal, undeniable flaw. She could never produce a single photograph of herself visiting my campus. She could never invite her friends to tour my laboratory. She was legally forbidden from setting foot on the property. During my first week as director, I sat down with the formidable corporate attorneys representing the university. I detailed the history of financial sabotage, the unauthorized access to my digital hardware, and the documented extortion attempt. The legal department responded with swift, terrifying institutional efficiency. They drafted formal, uncompromising trespass notices and delivered them via certified courier to Richard and Helen. The documents explicitly stated that any attempt by my parents to enter the university grounds, contact the academic staff, or approach my administrative building would result in immediate arrest and aggressive federal prosecution. I blocked their phone numbers, filtered their email addresses into a hidden deletion folder, and severed every remaining digital tether. They were locked outside the fortress of my new life, forced to watch my ascent from a distance, entirely powerless to extract a single dollar or a drop of prestige from my name. Richard, the patriarch who once dictated my future over a pot roast dinner, was reduced to a silent, irrelevant spectator in a family that had lost everything. I turned my chair away from the Gothic window and looked down at the vast expanse of my mahogany desk. The surface was immaculate, holding only a sleek laptop, a leather-bound notebook, and one single, solitary personal item resting near the edge of the polished wood. It was a small, silver-framed photograph. The picture captured Jack Mason and Lily sitting on a grassy park bench, their faces smeared with chocolate ice cream, laughing at something occurring just outside the camera frame. The image was taken during a rare, quiet afternoon 2 years ago, long before the legal battles and the shattered wine glasses. I reached out, tracing the cool metal edge of the silver frame with my index finger. They were the only fragments of my past that I truly missed. The grief of leaving them behind in that toxic environment was a heavy stone I carried in my pocket every day. I knew Sarah would struggle. I knew the apartment would be loud and chaotic. But I also knew that staying in that suburban prison would not have saved them. It would have simply destroyed me, leaving us all trapped in the dark. I had to build the empire first. I had to secure the resources, the title, and the unassailable independence. I looked at Jack's smiling face in the photograph. The behavioral software I designed for him was currently changing the lives of thousands of children across the country. He would eventually realize that the digital safety net he relied on carried his aunt's signature in the source code. I did not need to rescue them today. I just needed to remain steady, visible, and strong. I was building a sanctuary, a place of intellect and safety that existed far beyond the reach of their parents' failures. I knew the years would pass, the children would grow older, navigate their own paths, and eventually begin asking the difficult questions about why I disappeared. When they turned 18, when they were legally free from the suffocating grip of that family, they would know exactly where to find me. I smiled a genuine expression of profound peace and pulled my laptop toward the center of the desk. The empire built on my silent labor had collapsed into dust, but the future I had forged in the dark now burned with brilliant, unstoppable light. I opened my keyboard, ready to write the next sequence of code, holding the entire world firmly within my own 2 hands. I watched the relentless grinding machinery of modern American society, the manicured suburban lawns, the desperate pursuit of executive titles, the endless curation of digital perfection. And I see a profound, devastating spiritual starvation. As someone who walks a path of inner cultivation, seeking the quiet truths that reside far beneath our material illusions, the story of Callista Eugene resonates not merely as a tale of corporate triumph, but as a stark moral mirror. It reflects a society that has forgotten how to nurture the human soul, choosing instead to manage human utility. When we examine the architecture of the Eugene family, we are looking at the dark underbelly of the traditional American dream. In our culture, we often conflate provision with parenting. We falsely believe that securing a mortgage in an exclusive zip code, maintaining a country club membership, and pushing a child toward a prestigious corporate vice presidency is the pinnacle of familial duty. But a house rich in square footage can be utterly bankrupt in morality. Richard and Helen built a performative empire, prioritizing the optics of success over the sacred responsibility of raising holistic, compassionate human beings. They treated their children not as souls entrusted to their care, but as line items on a ledger. Sarah was the performing asset. Callista was the disposable utility. For the parents navigating the complex landscape of American culture, the message embedded within this tragedy is urgent and severe. True traditional values are not found in the rigid enforcement of practical roles or the worship of commercial prestige. A family structure that demands the sacrifice of one child's potential to subsidize another's facade is not practicing tradition. It is practicing exploitation. We must engage in the difficult work of self-correction, looking inward to dismantle our own egos and unfulfilled ambitions before we project them onto our offspring. Parenting requires a foundation of unwavering honesty, fairness, and profound emotional awareness. When you elevate one child while discarding another because they do not fit your aesthetic of success, you are planting the seeds of your own eventual ruin. You cannot build a lasting legacy on a foundation of deceit. The universe operates on a fundamental law of cause and effect. The parents in this narrative lost their empire because they extracted its bricks from the spine of their youngest daughter. To raise children properly, parents must cultivate their own inner morality, recognizing that a child's worth is intrinsic, not transactional. We must guide them not toward the highest salary, but toward the highest expression of their character. For the young people currently navigating the dark, suffocating corridors of toxic family dynamics, Callista's journey serves as a masterclass in spiritual and practical resilience. She teaches us that when the world strips you of your visible resources, you must build a sanctuary inside your own mind. Callista did not waste her energy engaging in screaming matches with people who were committed to misunderstanding her. She did not beg for validation from blind eyes. Instead, she turned her profound isolation into a monastery of self-cultivation. She teaches the youth the indispensable triad of a meaningful life: wisdom, morality, and resilience. She built her wisdom in the dark, studying coding by the glow of a nightlight, transforming her neglect into a razor-sharp intellect. She maintained her morality by refusing to abandon her nephew, choosing compassion for a struggling child over the bitterness that could have easily consumed her. And she forged an unbreakable resilience by quietly enduring the grueling, unacknowledged nights, laying the bricks of her escape, one line of code at a time. Callista proves that true power is never loud. It is the quiet, relentless compounding of inner strength. If you are the scapegoat in your family, understand that your exile is actually your liberation. The very neglect they use to diminish you provides the uninterrupted silence you need to build an empire they can never touch. These are the shadows we must drag into the light, the uncomfortable truths hidden behind the polished oak doors of our society. If you have ever had to build your own sanctuary in the dark, or if you recognize the bitter taste of a love that must be earned through silent servitude, you are not walking this path alone. Subscribe to Morning Revenge, where we dissect these silent domestic battles, expose the toxic ledgers of conditional love, and celebrate the quiet ones who finally hand back the bill. We are taught from a very young age that blood is the ultimate bond, the sacred, unbreakable tie that must be preserved at the cost of our own well-being. But perhaps the most dangerous idol in modern culture is the unconditional worship of the biological family. We are conditioned to believe that forgiveness and endless sacrifice are the only moral responses to familial betrayal. Yet true family is not an inheritance of genetics. It is a profound alignment of character. Sometimes the highest act of morality, the ultimate step in spiritual purification, is not forgiveness. It is departure. We leave the table not because we lack love, but because we finally realize that some people will only ever love the version of us they can consume. Leaving is not a failure of loyalty. It is the ultimate realization of self-worth. You must ask yourself as you turn the locks on the doors of your own home tonight, are you truly raising a family, or are you simply managing a portfolio? And if it is the latter, who is currently paying the price for your performance?